So, we're all traumatized. Now, this isn't actually something I realized until the past, say, 2 years ago. Because when you live a relatively good life and you don't really see anything as having gone wrong in a profound sense, you could say, it's difficult to conceive of the possibility that you could still be traumatized because, after all, people usually associate trauma with significant events that occur in their lives, significant suffering. But what what many people don't seem to realize now is that we're becoming traumatized by default almost. And this isn't necessarily because of the events we experience in our own lives. In fact, one could argue this is just the tip of the iceberg, although of course this does depend on the extent to which the trauma stems from events that have occurred in one's life. Although what's now being demonstrated in epigenetic studies is that many of us are inheriting a lot of trauma from our ancestors. That is, we are learning these trauma responses from previous generations and playing them out sometimes at a subconscious level without even realizing these responses stem from trauma. And that's the fascinating thing, really, because it gives an explanation for a lot of, for example, what we're seeing in society nowadays. It places the emphasis on survival behavior in the absence of a survival situation. That is, you could argue, that is the predominant problem we have with our society, is that we're operating on a sort of survival mindset as a sort of default setting. And many people argue this is human nature, and yeah, fair enough. You can make that argument to an extent, although I would say it goes deeper than that, and we can actually make the link here between this behavior and the trauma that we've experienced in our own lives and inherited from our ancestors. Because essentially what's happening here is we are perceiving a threat that no longer exists. We're perceiving threats that perhaps our ancestors experienced, and then this has been carried on into our own lives, and now we essentially have to worry about these responses that are perhaps disproportionate for the situation. So survival behavior, as I said, ego-driven pursuits like greed, focusing extensively on external events as sorts of determinants for our happiness. It all seems to stem from trauma at a fundamental level. And what this has led to is a sort of widespread suffering, you could argue, of our society, as we all sort of play out these trauma responses at a wide scale. And on this view, it actually seems quite plausible to argue that the roots of capitalism is actually based in trauma and this survival behavior that is caused by trauma responses. Because when we're in, for example, stressful situations, when we're perceiving ourselves to be in danger, the nervous system will respond in a way that corresponds with survival, with a prioritization of survival. And that's essentially what we're seeing on a mass scale. For example, with billionaires accruing all this wealth, taking it all from the lower class, because greed is a mechanism that's there for survival, to prioritize the survival of the individual, because the buffer essentially that you have provides a higher chance of survival in a period of deprivation if it comes to it. So ultimately you can still tie all these responses to trauma and survival, and it really does make sense at a collective level. We could consider even society to be a culmination of the collective ego for this reason, because with all this trauma that's sort of compounding, it forces society as a whole into a survival state, which naturally does lead to systems like capitalism, and even a deprioritization of human value itself. And this also seems to lead into spiritual concepts to quite a profound extent. Actually, it's quite intimately linked with spiritual concepts. Say the ego, in many spiritual traditions, it's believed that the ego is the root of all suffering. And on a trauma-focused view, you can sort of see that, well, to an extent, the strength of the ego, the foundation of the ego, is based on trauma itself. Because the more trauma we accumulate, typically, the more we're forced into a sort of survival mode, the more we're forced into focusing on the external and satisfying the demands of the ego. And yes, we do see this in society at a wide scale, as I've argued. Now, naturally, what actually seems to be the case is that if you have less trauma, or if you're able to process your trauma, there is then less ego drive. There is less drive to focus on the external. So what this seems to show is that our society itself is a trauma construct, essentially. It is born of these survival mechanisms that keep us fixated on the external, on external things like wealth, like fame, like, for example, power, like connections, like sex, like intimacy. All these things are founded on survival behavior, because we have this fundamental belief, because of our trauma responses, that this is how we have to be happy in society, essentially. When in reality, well, it doesn't really seem to be the case. We take a look at ancient Eastern teachings, for example. They teach us that the true happiness in life actually lies in detachment from the ego, not really focusing on these external things to such an extent, not allowing them to determine our happiness. And we can even see this in, for example, philosophies like Stoicism, and how we don't necessarily need to suffer due to external events. It's rather our perceptions of the events themselves that cause suffering. Now, this is well understood in ancient Eastern traditions. Say, for example, Buddhism teaches that the striving itself, the craving itself, is what leads to suffering, attempting to grasp onto things that we want while simultaneously avoiding those that we don't want. And then based on the outcome of this, it determines how happy or how sad we are. Therefore, we can make a plausible argument that true happiness actually lies in detachment from ego, and that society has it all wrong with its external focus, its ego-driven focus. And perhaps that's the most tragic thing of all, because essentially what we've done in Western society is we've ignored these ancient Eastern traditions. We've ignored these teachings that can essentially lead us to true fulfillment and in an internal level, regardless of what the external conditions are. I mean, it's well documented. For example, enlightened beings throughout history have been able to weather incredible suffering to be able to get to the position they eventually ended up in, which is liberation from the ego itself, which essentially just leads to satisfaction regardless of these conditions. And yeah, like this all links back to trauma, as I've said, because the foundation of the ego is trauma. But what's interesting, actually, as I was talking about the influence of society on... I was talking about, the influence of trauma on society. What's particularly fascinating is that in these traditions, it was actually predicted, for example, through various cycles, how the ego would influence society at large. For example, through the Yuga cycle of Hinduism, we have periods of decadence, of ego-driven pursuit that leads to sort of widespread suffering, similar to what we see today. And while they may not necessarily be true at a specific level or a holistic level, I believe the fundamentals of these sorts of beliefs are quite accurate. And that's perhaps the most tragic thing of all, because we were told about this. We already had this knowledge available to us from these people, these people that existed thousands of years ago, and yet we have sort of just discarded what they've been saying, disregarding it because we consider the information to be outdated almost, and we have this sort of superior understanding of how to live fulfilling lives. Well, no, because just look at society now, where many people aren't happy, many people aren't fulfilled, and in fact you could even go as far as to argue that the majority aren't. It's really not serving us all too well. I mean, look at Gen Z, for example. There's record rates of mental illness in our generation, in my generation, and it's just sad, really, because it never needed to be this way, and there's plenty we can do about it now. If we have the understanding that this sort of paradigm that we're living in is founded on trauma and trauma responses at a wide scale, is founded on survival-driven behavior, then we can take steps to sort of resolve that. We can take steps to heal and build a society that is not only more fulfilling for us, but also more kind to the planet as a whole, more kind to each other, more humanizing. Because I'd argue that nowadays the society that we're living in is antithetical to these sorts of principles. Our society that we're living in today is inherently dehumanizing, perceiving people as products or data points, or let's say value points based on what they contribute to society, or based on how attractive they are, based on how intelligent they are. This isn't, I'd argue, the natural way for a human society to be structured in a trauma-free context. Well, the message I'm trying to get across is that maybe our priorities are in the wrong place, because we are continually focusing on all these external solutions that perhaps don't even have that much force, because they don't address the root cause of the issue, which is the trauma, which is the survival driven behavior, the ego that is fueling a society that is inherently dehumanizing. So where should the focus be instead? In my opinion, the focus should be on the internal, not the external, because if we heal from our trauma at an internal level, as opposed to sort of trying to seek solutions in the external world, I believe what we can then do is actually rectify this problem at a fundamental level. We can address the root, and then we can build a more humanizing society for everyone. So in further videos, I'll be talking about what trauma actually is, how it's stored in the body, what the sorts of effects and symptoms of it can be, as well as how we can go ahead and heal from our trauma, and the most efficient ways we can do this. So look forward to that. Alright, this has been Fol. Do me a favour and have a wonderful rest of your day, and remember that you are an amazing person who deserves all the good that the world throws at you. Goodbye. I hope to see you again soon.